They called him the Monster King long before anyone could have told you his real name. In the market squares of the southern towns, where lanterns swayed like small moons and spice smoke drifted up into the rafters, mothers used his title the way they used storm warnings. "Come inside before the sun falls," they would say. "The king of Vargos wakes when the last light leaves. Don't look toward the mountains. Don't call his attention." And the children listened, not because they understood, but because fear is easy to inherit. It passes hand to hand like a coin, warm from another person's palm. It settles into the stories people repeat when their lives feel too fragile to hold without explanation. North of those markets rose the Blackthorn Range, a line of peaks that always seemed a shade darker than the sky behind them. Beyond the highest pass lay Vargos, the old stone keep that had stood through kingdoms collapsing like sandcastles. Travelers claimed its windows were always unlit, that the ravens on its towers looked like ink stains that wouldn't wash away, that the wind near its gates carried a coldness that wasn't weather. No one said, out loud, that they had ever met the king himself. That was the strange part. People feared him with a certainty that sounded like memory, but most of that fear was second-hand. It was stories, old treaties, and the way a village elder's voice lowered when he spoke of the undead. It was the way a priest's blessing lingered longer at dusk. It was the comfort of having a single shape for all that could not be explained: famine, illness, a missing traveler, a late frost. If you asked the blacksmith in the riverside village of Halewick what he thought, he would wipe his hands on his apron and say, "A creature like that can't have a heart. Only hunger." If you asked Mara, the midwife, she would glance at the mountains and answer more softly, "No one lives that long and stays kind." Halewick was small enough that the river did most of its talking for it. It ran clear in spring, shallow in summer, and in autumn it filled with fallen leaves and the scent of rot from the orchard banks. People lived close there, close enough that you could hear a neighbor's lullaby through the wall, close enough that news traveled faster than rain. And still, fear traveled faster. The year the story begins was not a year of war. The roads were passable. The king on the human throne in the capital was young and more interested in rebuilding bridges than in marching armies. There were no banners on the horizon, no drums in the distance. Yet something uneasier than war had arrived in the valleys. It started with sheep that refused to graze in the eastern fields. Then dogs that tucked their tails and stared at empty air. Then the old oak behind Halewick's chapel lost its leaves weeks early, as if it had decided to be bare rather than endure what was coming. At first, the villagers blamed the mountains. They always did. "Vargos stirs," someone whispered at the well. "The Monster King is hungry," said another. Each rumor was a pebble dropped into the same pond, widening circles of dread. The elder called for extra prayers. The blacksmith checked the locks twice. Mara dried herbs and watched the sky with narrowed eyes. Only one person in Halewick held the fear differently, like something he did not quite believe but could not ignore. Thomas, the schoolkeeper, was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of listening too carefully. He had come to Halewick from the city years ago, after the city's noise had worn him down. He kept a small classroom near the mill where children learned their letters and learned, too, the careful art of pretending not to be afraid. Because fear was a lesson people gave without knowing. On a grey afternoon, Thomas found a small bundle on the schoolhouse steps, a folded cloth tied with twine. Inside were 3 apples, each polished as if someone had rubbed them clean with a sleeve, and a scrap of paper with a single word written in neat, old-fashioned script. "For them." No signature. No explanation. It could have been any neighbor. It could have been a traveler passing through. Yet something about the handwriting made Thomas think of old books and forgotten libraries. He carried the apples inside and set them on the table where the children shared their lunches. When the youngest boy, Jory, reached for one, Thomas said nothing at all. He only watched the way Jory's face softened at the unexpected gift, like a bud opening. That night, Thomas stood at his window with a candle and listened to the river. A thin mist crawled over the water. On the far bank, near the willow trees, someone moved, too silently for an ordinary person crossing wet ground. Thomas leaned closer to the glass. The figure paused. It did not look toward the village lights or toward the schoolhouse. It only stood still, as if listening to something the village could not hear. Then it was gone, leaving the mist to settle back into itself. In the days that followed, small things began to happen that did not fit easily inside fear. A torn section of the east fence was repaired overnight, the broken boards replaced with new wood that did not match the rest but was sturdy. No one admitted to doing it. The blacksmith complained about the workmanship, too neat, he grumbled, as if neatness itself was suspicious. A sack of grain appeared in old Rella's shed, tucked behind the barrels where she would find it when her hands went searching in the dark. Rella cried in the morning and told everyone it was her dead husband looking after her. The priest agreed, because it was easier for his faith than the alternative. Mara discovered a jar of honey on her doorstep, still warm, with wildflowers pressed in the wax seal. There was no note, but the jar was the exact kind she used in her medicines. She stood in the doorway for a long time, the honey heavy in her hands, her expression pinched with confusion and something that looked almost like grief. "You think it's him," Thomas said later, when they met by the well. Mara's eyes flicked toward the mountains, then away again. "I think," she answered slowly, "that kindness can be used like a hook. And I don't want my village caught." Thomas did not argue. He only looked at the honey jar cradled against her apron, and at the way her fingers held it as if it might vanish. The unease in the valley, however, did not vanish. It deepened. The air grew heavy with the feeling of being watched, not by a person but by something old and patient. Traders from the north began to travel in groups, their carts rattling faster through the narrow road. One of them stopped in Halewick to water his horses and told the elder, voice shaking, that a thing had been seen in the forests beyond the pass, something that moved like shadow but left footprints like a great deer and breathed like a furnace. "A wraith beast," the trader whispered, crossing himself. "It eats fear. It grows on it." The elder's face went pale. "Those are mountain tails." "I saw the scorch marks on the trees," the trader said. "Not fire. Not lightning. Something else. Like cold heat. Like the world forgetting itself." Fear in Halewick, already stirred, turned into a quiet panic. They barred their doors early. They kept children inside. The priest lit extra candles, not for hope but for the comfort of something bright. The blacksmith hammered iron late into the night, the sound like a heartbeat trying to prove it was still there. Thomas watched all of it and felt, under his own worry, another question forming. If the wraith beast truly fed on fear, then the village's dread was not just a feeling, it was an invitation. On the third night after the trader's warning, the river mist rose thicker than Thomas had ever seen. It rolled through the streets like a slow creature, curling around fence posts and stone walls. The moon was a pale coin behind cloud. Thomas could not sleep. He sat at his desk, listening. Then he heard it, a sound that did not belong to any night animal. Not a howl, not a shriek. It was lower than that, like a deep breath pulled through cracks in the earth. The hair rose on his arms. From outside came a faint thud, then another, heavy steps on soft ground. He opened his door and stepped into the cold. The village lane lay empty, but the mist had a direction now. It flowed toward the eastern fields, where the fence had been repaired. Thomas followed at a distance, his lantern held low. He knew he was doing something foolish. Yet curiosity can be stronger than caution, and sometimes a person walks toward fear simply because they cannot bear not knowing. At the edge of the fields, he stopped. There, half hidden by the mist, stood a figure cloaked in dark fabric that seemed to drink moonlight. The figure's posture was still, almost reverent, as if the land itself were a sacred place. Thomas could not see the face clearly, but he saw a pale hand resting on the repaired fence. He saw the way the hand lingered there, gently, as if feeling the grain of the wood. Beyond the fence, in the field, something shifted. At first Thomas thought it was a shadow cast by moving clouds. Then he realized the shadow had weight. It unfolded from the ground like a stain lifting itself into a shape. Its outline was wrong, too long in the limbs, too narrow in the middle, as if it had been stretched. Its eyes, when they opened, were not eyes at all but pale points like distant frost. The air around it seemed to thin. Thomas's breath caught. He felt, suddenly, his own fear become tangible, as if it were scent carried on his skin. The cloaked figure did not move away. It stepped forward, between the village and the thing in the field. A quiet voice spoke, low and calm, as if soothing a restless animal. "Not here." The words were not shouted. They were not a command wrapped in cruelty. They were simply a refusal, gentle but immovable, like a hand pressed against a door. The wraith beast shifted. The mist around it quivered. Thomas felt, in his bones, a pressure like a headache. The thing was tasting the fear in the air. The cloaked figure raised one hand. In the dim light, Thomas saw a ring on the finger, old silver etched with a symbol that looked like a thorned crown. The figure did not draw a weapon. It did not lunge. It only opened its palm as if offering something invisible. The air changed. The pressure eased, not because the beast retreated, but because something else filled the space, a stillness so complete it was like stepping into a quiet room after a storm. Thomas realized, with a jolt, that his fear was fading, not because he was safe, but because he was being shielded. His thoughts slowed. His breathing steadied. The panic that had been ready to swallow him was softened, muted, held back as if by a curtain. The beast recoiled, as if starved. It shifted again, restless. The cloaked figure spoke once more, almost tenderly. "You won't feed on them." The beast's pale points flared. It lunged, not in a dramatic leap, but in a swift glide that made the grass bend away. It moved straight toward the figure. Thomas wanted to run. He could not move. The figure stepped forward to meet it, not with anger, but with the weary certainty of someone who had made this choice before. There was no clash of steel. No spray of blood. No monstrous roar. Instead, the cloaked figure drew the beast's attention the way a lantern draws moths. The air around them shimmered as if heat rose from stones in summer. The beast circled, frustrated, unable to find purchase on the fear it craved. And then Thomas understood the terrible simplicity of it. The figure was offering the beast something else. Not the village's fear. Not the children's nightmares. Something older and heavier, sorrow, perhaps, or loneliness, or a burden carried too long. The kind of quiet ache that does not scream but never ends. The kind of feeling that might be endless in someone who had lived far beyond a normal span. The beast pressed close, drawn by it. For a moment, its outline became clearer, as if it were feeding. The cloaked figure's shoulders tightened. The pale hand trembled slightly. Yet the figure did not step back. It stood and let the beast drink from the well of its own inner darkness, so the village would not have to. Thomas's throat tightened. He had never seen sacrifice made so silently. A gust of wind swept through the field, cold and sharp, and the mist tore apart in ribbons. The beast suddenly faltered. Its shape lost cohesion, like smoke struck by rain. It writhed, not in pain, but in confusion, as if the thing it fed on had turned to something it could not digest. The cloaked figure's voice came again, barely more than breath. Sleep. The word was a lullaby. The beast shuddered and sank toward the ground, its pale points dimming. It did not die in a dramatic way. It simply unraveled, dissolving back into shadow and soil, as if the night itself had exhaled and let it go. When it was gone, the field felt ordinary again, damp grass, crooked fence, a lone lantern's glow. The cloaked figure swayed. Thomas took a step forward before he could stop himself. "Are you